bene il proprio mestiere.
Non diventare semplicemente dei funzionari
di un'Europa.
Disuguaglianza.
Mafia significa anche impoverimento.
Un treno che parte, una scuola che apre.
Perché dovrei preoccuparmi?
Capiscono che la mafia è tanto più forte quando una parte.
Come si fa a
la scienza ha senso,
i contratti in sé non sono né buoni né cattivi.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti, grazie.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome for coming. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here in this hall and in the other 3 halls. I understand that 3 further halls have been set up for this meeting, so there's a large audience. Many people are coming to hear Professor Easterly. Today, indeed, we have with us one of the top economists on development worldwide, Professor William Easterly. He has a chair at the New York University. He has had a long experience as development economist at the World Bank. Today he's here with us to present us a book that has been published in Italy as well by La Terza. The title of his book being The Tyranny of Experts, Communist Dictators and Denied Rights of the Poor. At some point, perhaps at the end of the book, Professor Easterly says, if you're reading this book, it means that the problem of development and emergence from poverty is something that is close to your heart. And it is reassuring to see that in this city, one of the richest, wealthiest in Italy, there's such a big interest. So you are not here to listen to me. So I'm going to make a long story short, and I'd like just to pinpoint one of the subject which is most interesting, I think, in his book. Professor Easterly probably is going to dwell on that. Actually, as a matter of fact, I'd like to refer to 2 things. The technocratic approach on the policy for emergence of poverty is the direct consequence of colonialism. And indeed, in his book, there's a red thread pointing to the connections between what happened in the 1800, 1900, from the colonialism to technocratic approach, and not considering the rights of the individuals in the country where apparently development is advocated, and a merely technocratic approach clearly does not work. The approach trying to tackle individual issues connected to development and not considering the matter as a whole are doomed to fail, because the rights of population and individuals are actually to be taken into greatest attention. Professor Easterly obviously is going to present us with his point of view as in this book. But let me just take advantage of this opportunity for putting a question to him, if I may. Over the last few years, the Clark Medal is always given to the economist to the top or the brightest economist with the last 40 years. Roland Fryer, Duflo, a couple of years ago, were granted this medal. And these economists, studying different samples of population in different areas, took a completely different perspective vis-à-vis the one that you advocated. So their perspective is that development should be aimed at whatever works, practically speaking. So, for example, Esther Duflo analyzed through randomized tests carried out on the local population whether certain types of prevention against malaria turn out to be successful or not. Roland Fryer, on the other hand, tried and understand what works in the education system, what kind of incentive, a monetary incentive, can be given to students or teachers to make them more higher achievers. Then you refer to the Why Nations Fail, and Robinson and his co-workers lay emphasis on the institutional aspects. Fukuyama lay emphasis on institutional aspects as well as other economists do that one way or the other deal with the development. You lay emphasis on the rights of individuals. So my question again, if I may ask you, is why is your approach different from that of these young economists that have been awarded important acknowledgement with their tests carried out on the local populations? Why do you talk less about the importance of institutions? Why don't you think that bureaucracy, inefficient bureaucracy, uncorrupted bureaucracy is not as important as the other young economists say?
For one thing, I'm not a young economist. I really respect the work of Esther Duflo and Roland Fryer. The theme that we're really going to talk about today that they are not able to address in their methodology is that the roots of poverty are political. The roots of poverty lie in the denial of political rights to the poor. What this talk is going to call the right to be mobile, the right to be upwardly mobile, to ascend upward out of poverty. So that is the basic disagreement, that everything comes out of rights, out of the rights of the poor. Out of that comes good institutions. Out of that comes the things that work. So let me start right away into the talk. I hope I answered that question. Thank you. Now, before I actually begin the main body of the talk, I have to do one brief commercial announcement. I have a very kind publisher here in Italy, and he insisted that I put up this slide. I apologize for the self-promotion. He gave me no choice whatsoever. He insisted. So please buy this book in Italian, even if you don't speak Italian. So let me begin with a story that I think will illustrate the roots of poverty in the denial of the right to be mobile. So what I'm going to talk about in this talk, I'm going to focus on Africa as an example of a whole continent that has been trapped at the bottom of the world income distribution. The whole continent has been denied after a very long history in which the West plays a very guilty part. Africa has been denied the right to be mobile, the right to be upwardly mobile in the world income distribution. Let me start with one very simple, precise story. On the morning of Sunday, February 28, 2010, in a place called Mubende District, Uganda, some farmers and their families were in church when they heard the sound of gunfire coming from outside the church. And they came outside and they saw some men with guns burning down their homes, torching their crops, shooting their livestock, and keeping them at gunpoint from rescuing their homes. There was an 8-year-old child who died in the fire. This, I think, captures the essence of the denial of the right to be mobile. How can you be mobile when your land is taken away at gunpoint? Your crops are destroyed, your homes are burnt down. What's surprising about this story is that this was a project that was backed by the leading Western-financed, Western-run development agency, my former employer, the World Bank. It was part of a forestry project in which the land was going to be sold to a British company called the New Forest Company, and the sale was going to enrich the Ugandan government, which was run by a dictator who's been in power for 29 years, named Yoweri Museveni. And so the pattern here is a local oppressor with Western backing is denying rights to the poor, very basic elementary rights. The rights to your own home, the rights to your land. The farmers were marched away at gunpoint and told this land is no longer yours. It's now more than 5 years since this happened. The day after this story was actually reported in the New York Times, the World Bank promised they would do an investigation. That investigation has never happened. The sad truth about this story is that nobody cared. Nobody cared what happened to these farmers. So what we're going to see here is the recurrence of a common pattern through a very long history. That there is some Western support for a local oppressive power that violates the rights of the poor, and because of the violation of the rights of the poor in Africa stay poor, Africa as a whole stays poor. So I think it's fairly obvious why not being able to have your own land and your own house and your own crops denies you the right to be mobile, but also the absence of political rights denies these farmers the rights to be mobile. They did not have the political right to protest. Museveni, as I said, has been in power for 29 years. He's securely in power in part because he is an ally of the United States and the United Kingdom in the war on terror. The U.S. gives him lots of military aid, lots of economic aid to help keep him in power. And so the unintentional alliance of the U.S. foreign policy, the World Bank, and a local oppressor lead to the denial of the right to be mobile to the majority of Africans. Now this tendency has a very long history. So I'm now going to move to give you some of the historical roots of this pattern of Western-backed oppression in Africa. And I'm actually going to start a lot earlier than you might expect. And we're going to start in the year 1483. So I have to ask you to be patient. This talk is going to last a little bit longer than some of the other talks in this conference. It's going to last 532 years. So please get comfortable. I hope you have some water. Please relax. So here's a picture of what happened in Mubende, Uganda, after the devastation of the farmers that burned down Mubende, Uganda. What happened in 1483 was there was a Portuguese ship captain named Diego Cao. He was sailing off Central Africa and he came upon a river. The locals told him the name of the river was what he called in Portuguese Zaire. That name was later going to be attached to that country, Zaire. It's today called the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And what happened in 1483 was the birth of the slave trade. So the history of the roots of Western-backed oppression in Africa go back to 1483, even before Columbus and the discovery of America. So the Portuguese immediately started trading slaves from the Congo region, and the Congo Kingdom in turn raided with the Portuguese traded guns in exchange for slaves to the chief of the Congo Kingdom. And the Congo Kingdom in turn raided other kingdoms around them to capture slaves to sell to the Portuguese. So here we have the pattern, once again, of Western-backed oppression leading to the denial of, in the most horrific way possible, of the right to be mobile, the creation of the African slave trade that trapped millions and millions of African slaves for centuries at the bottom of the world income distribution. So I have here a little graphic. Here's going to be the first phase in our history. I'm going to give you several phases in history. Here's the first phase. The slave trade, which lasted all the way from 1483 to the 1800s. So the pattern here is Western slave traders from Portugal, from the United Kingdom, from the Netherlands, were oppressing locals by capturing them as slaves, but they also did have the help of local oppressors. They had the help of slave-raiding kingdoms who helped them capture slaves to sell into slavery in the Americas and in Europe. I'm listing here 4 countries that I'm going to follow through quickly over the next 500 years of history. I'm going to follow these countries through very quickly in their history. So the countries are Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, and Uganda. Congo, I've already mentioned, was a victim of the slave trade. Ghana was a victim of the slave trade. The local slave-raiding kingdom was the Ashanti Kingdom in the interior of Ghana, who sold slaves to the British. to finance, it was actually a lot of slaves from Ghana that wound up in the Americas, that wound up in my country in the southern United States. Ethiopia is a much less known victim of the slave trade. In this case, it was a victim of the Arab slave trade, where the Arabs captured slaves and sold them across the Red Sea and across the Sahara. And then Uganda I'm including because it actually was affected a little bit by the slave trade. So there is even a slave trade route in Uganda. Now, one unusual thing that economists have been doing in recent times, by the way, I want to do a sound check I should have done at the beginning. Can all of you in the back hear me? Please, in the back, raise your hands if you can hear me okay. Yes, that's great. So, one unusual thing that economists have been doing in recent times is tracing how much the modern roots of development today go back to these historical factors like the slave trade. There's another Harvard historian named Nathan Nunn, economic historian and great economic researcher, who did a paper showing that the more intensely one region of Africa was a victim of the slave trade from the 1400s through the 1800s, the more poor they are today. And so Congo is one of the poorest countries in all of Africa, and that's kind of the supreme example of a country that still today is suffering from being a victim, a very large-scale victim of the slave trade. And that pattern has been established statistically throughout Africa by Nathan Nunn. The more a country was a victim of the slave trade, the more poor they are today. So a counterexample is Botswana, which was in the interior of Africa and safe from the slave traders. And Botswana is one of the most prosperous countries in Africa today, and has had one of the fastest growth rates over the past 50 years. So the pattern is simple, that there is a local oppressor, but the main cause of the local oppression is the Western powers intervening in Africa. So now let's go to the next phase of Africa's history, which is, eventually people persuaded European powers to end the slave trade. And in that, of course, played a very important part the resistance of the slaves themselves in ending the slave trade. And so we moved into only a slightly more benevolent phase called colonialism, which lasted from the 1800s to around 1960, when most African states became independent. Now again, a pattern of colonialism that is not that well known is that once again the colonialists financed and put in power a group of local oppressors through a system called indirect rule. So for example, in Ghana, one of the countries I'm listing here, the Ashanti Kingdom, the Ashanti chiefs were put in power by the British during the colony of Ghana when it was called the Gold Coast, but they were given even more power than they had before the British had arrived. They were even more powerful with even fewer checks and balances on the Ashanti chiefs, what they could do as oppressors to the local people. And that pattern is repeated in every one of the countries, again, that I've listed here: Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Uganda. Each one of them, during the period of colonial rule, had chiefs. Sometimes the chiefs were even invented by the British colonialists. In Uganda, there were chiefs that were just invented by the British colonialists and given absolute power. They were given the power to coerce forced labor from the locals, some of which they did on behalf of the British, but some of which they kept for themselves. They were given the power to collect taxes, which they turned over to the British, but a lot they kept for themselves. So once again, we see the power of the combination of Western powers, who were in this case were colonialists, and local oppressors created by the British and by the other colonizers. I was going to mention the Italian attempt to colonize Ethiopia, but I'm going to skip over that for lack of time. I hope you appreciate that. In the Belgian Congo, that was, of course, an even more brutal case of colonialism, in which King Leopold created many atrocities in the course of colonialism, but again, using local oppressors as intermediaries. Now, colonizers, one of the predictions of the absence of political rights is not only that the colonizers and the local allies can do whatever they want to the local indigenous people, but also that they have no incentive to do anything good for the local indigenous people. So, for example, in the Belgian Congo at independence, there was only 1% to 2% of Africans in secondary school at independence in 1960. And at independence in 1960 in the Belgian Congo, on June 30th, 1960, there was a grand total of 17 Congolese university graduates. Only 17 Congolese in 1960 had a university education. That's how little the colonizers had done for education during colonial rule. And that's true in each one of these examples that I am giving you: Congo, Ethiopia, Ghana, Uganda. Again, all of them denied the majority of the population the right to be mobile. Then our next phase of history is after the end of colonialism, during the Cold War. And in a more mild form, we still have the pattern of an alliance of Western powers with local oppressors. So now it's the U.S. during the Cold War is supporting dictators who are allies of the U.S. against the Soviets in the war on terror. So in the Congo, for example, the CIA was involved in a plot to assassinate the independence hero Patrice Lumumba at independence and turn power over to a dictator that you will have heard of named Mobutu, a dictator that was going to stay in power for 30 years, during which his only accomplishment was to change the name of the Congo back to that old name, Zaire. I hope the Congolese appreciated that, because that was his only accomplishment during his time in power, while the U.S. was supporting him as a valuable ally in the war on terror. Similar story in the other examples I've given here. In Ethiopia, the brutal autocrat Haile Selassie was supported by the U.S. during the Cold War. Uganda was supported during the Cold War. In Ghana, the CIA was involved in another plot to assassinate overthrow in a military coup, another independence hero, Kwame Nkrumah, who gave way to a long series of military dictators backed by the U.S. during the Cold War as allies against the Soviets. That's the same pattern of Western oppression backing local oppressors. And one of the examples of the denial of the right to be mobile in Ghana was the military dictators in Ghana denied those who were growing cocoa, which was one of the main avenues of upward mobility in Ghana, was to grow cocoa for export and sell it on the world market. Ghana was the world's leading producer of cocoa. But this had actually started during the British colonial times. The British colonizers had insisted that the cocoa farmers sell not to the world market, but to them, to the British colonizers, at a very low price, and then the British sold the cocoa at a much higher price to the world market and kept the profits. The same pattern occurred once again under the military dictators backed by the U.S. during the Cold War. Those dictators again kept in power the cocoa marketing board that had been put in place by the British and forced the cocoa farmers to sell to them at a very low price, and then they were able to sell at a very high price, thus enriching the government in power and their cronies. And so in another very common pattern, they are creating a political and economic elite. A local oppressor backed by the U.S. is obviously a political elite because they are in power. They're also creating an economic elite by denying the majority of the population the right to make their own living, taxing cocoa extremely heavily and keeping their proceeds, keeping an economic elite and political elite allied in power at the top, denying the majority of the population at the bottom the right to be mobile. So now finally, the last thing I have to mention about the colonial period about the Cold War period is Ethiopia, of course, was an ally in the U.S. war in the Cold War against the Soviets. And then at a certain point, Haile Selassie fell from power, and the Soviets and the U.S. switched places. The Soviets started backing the Marxist ruler who overthrew Haile Selassie, and the U.S. started backing Somalia. Yet another example of how arbitrary was the Cold War alliances during the Cold War. Now we finally are going to get to the modern period. I'm glad we've been able to get through 500 years pretty quickly. The modern period is the War on Terror, which actually started before 9/11. It started in the 1990s. And here now the dictators are still receiving U.S., the American and the British backing, but now it's no longer because of the Cold War, it's because of the War on Terror. So Ethiopia, the current regime of the dictator Haile Selassie, who was in power from 1991 until his death from natural causes in 2012, he received U.S. backing in the War on Terror because he was like the only Christian ruler they could find in a region surrounded by Islamic countries that the U.S. was blaming for perpetrating the War on Terror, even though Haile Selassie was another brutal dictator that I'm going to describe a little bit more in a minute. In Uganda, I've already mentioned that Museveni was a major ally in the War on Terror, so we connect the threads once again. From going back to the slave trade up to the present, Uganda, Museveni is today in power partly because he's such a valuable U.S. ally in the War on Terror. Ugandan troops, for example, are involved in Somalia in fighting what the U.S. views as terrorist forces in Somalia. And so that's an excuse to overlook those abuses that I mentioned at the beginning, that even if you take farmers' land and crops at gunpoint, the U.S. will not care because the Ugandan dictator is a valuable ally in the War on Terror. So that ends the history lesson, and now we're going to start talking about today, and yet even today we'll have a little bit of a history lesson. The other thing that's unusual about this history is that even though I've described a sort of five centuries of Western oppression, at many points along the way, there were also Western humanitarians who justified what was happening in the name of humanitarian economic development. So we've seen that pattern already, and I mentioned at the beginning that the World Bank, the world's leading humanitarian development agency, was involved in a project that led to that forced dispossession of the Ugandan farmers that I mentioned at the beginning. But now I'm going to give you a slight historical example that this pattern actually did start during colonialism. There was a British colonial official named Lord Haile who was a genius at justifying colonial rule as not actually about oppression and exploitation and British power and acting in the interests of the British. But he tried to convince the world, somewhat successfully, that the British Empire was a force for good, for humanitarian good, for doing good things to end the material poverty of Africans where the British Empire was operating. This official, Lord Haile, he justified colonial rule as necessary to achieve the end of poverty, and he said that had to happen first before the end of colonialism. He said, quote, "Political liberties are meaningless unless they can be built up on a better foundation of social and economic progress." Now, decoded, that means please forget your rights to be independent of British colonial rule until colonial rule is finished with you, lifting you out of poverty. And his justification for colonial rule was that the British were part of what he called a movement, this is a quote, "a movement for the betterment of the backward peoples of the world." Well, that language sounds very condescending and racist, and it was. Today we would say movement for the development of the underdeveloped countries. This is how Lord Haile justified colonialism. And we see some of these themes recurring again today. Today, there are many humanitarian justifications for supporting dictators because it is believed that dictators may be the best route to implement quickly technical solutions to poverty to lift Africans out of poverty. Let me give you a kind of comparison. So there was a report that Lord Haile, the British colonial official that I mentioned, was the head of in 1938. It was called the African Survey, a very kind of neutral name for this attempt to solve African poverty. And here on the left hand, on the columns over here on the left, are the different problems that the British colonial rule was trying to solve. And they suggested these specific technical solutions. So, for example, for malaria, there's a chemical called pyrethrum that you can spray on the indoors on the walls of people's houses to kill the mosquitoes and prevent malaria. Now, what's interesting about this is these recommendations match up exactly with the United Nations report that was done 70 years later in 2005, which once again, about malaria, mentioned the spraying of pyrethroids, the same chemical, on the indoor walls of houses to kill the mosquitoes to prevent malaria. The United Nations report, I've said the African survey was done by Lord Haile. The United Nations report was done by someone you may have heard of named Jeffrey Sachs. Anybody here heard of Jeffrey Sachs? Yes. He was working with some other well-known development economists named Bono and an even more famous development economist that I admire named Angelina Jolie. So they together collaborated and found the same technical solutions that the British had found 70 years ago. So this is the essence of what Mr. Fubini, thank you very much for the kind introduction and the exposition that you gave of the book's point. This is the essence of what we could call the technocratic approach that pretends that poverty is about technical solutions and that ignores the political roots of poverty that I've described to you today. It ignores them. How well does that approach work? Well, it didn't work during colonial times. It isn't working today, as you can see from the fact that the problems have remained unchanged over 70 years. The problems are the same. The technical solutions are the same. So apparently very little progress has been made during the technocratic regime of attempting technical solutions without addressing the political roots, the denial of the right to be mobile during 70 years. And so here we see that the technocratic approach is not the most promising, that we really cannot be silent about the political roots of poverty. Now, another humanitarian, unexpected humanitarian who gave justification today for sort of technocratic approaches that endorse autocrats, endorse local oppressors, and overlook the political roots of poverty is another man you may have heard of named Bill Gates. Bill Gates praised the Ethiopian government, who said he praised Meles Zenawi, the Ethiopian dictator, for setting clear goals. This is a quote from Gates, setting, quote, clear goals, measuring results, and then using those measurements to continually refine our approach. The approach is completely technical and completely ignores the political roots of poverty. Gates said that this, quote, helps us to deliver tools and services to everybody who will benefit. Gates's foundation has spent $265 million in Ethiopia. And during that whole time, he said that he had, quote, a great working relationship with Meles Zenawi. He said Meles Zenawi's policies have made real progress in helping the people of Ethiopia. And even after Meles died from natural causes in 2012, I confess I was really sad when Meles died because he was my favorite example of a technocratic dictator that was loved by the West. I was very sorrowful that he died. I sent flowers to his funeral. But Gates gave even stronger praise to Meles after he died, saying that his thoughtfulness and knowledge had transformed Ethiopia, and he praised his equally dictatorial successor named Haile Mariam for his commitment to continuing the same policies of Meles Zenawi. Now, how benevolent, how successful really was Meles Zenawi? Well, I have to give you a whole nother story of denying farmers the right to their own land, which happened in Ethiopia. So we have one story that began this talk in Uganda. We have another story that it happened under Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia. A very courageous farmer who, because of his fear of being tortured by the Ethiopian government, would only go under the name Mr. O. Mr. O sued the British government because the British government had given aid to the Ethiopian government for a project known as villagization. The British aid agency and the U.S. aid agency and the World Bank had all supported villagization in the southern region of Gambela in Ethiopia under Meles Zenawi, which again took land away at gunpoint from farmers and resettled them against their will in government villages that lacked basic services. So the same pattern keeps recurring across the centuries of Western-backed local oppressors denying rights to Africans, denying Africans the right to be mobile. And of course, another symptom of this denial of the right to be mobile is that African migrants are fleeing the lands where they're oppressed and trying to come to Europe, to lands that have less oppressive rulers, to try to find freedom in Europe. Now, this has been an unhappy story so far. I'm sorry about that. It's been sad. It's been unhappy. I've criticized a lot of people. I want to review some of the people I've criticized here. Here is a picture of Lord Haile, the man who gave a humanitarian justification for British colonialism. Here is Bill Gates. And then here are some of the prominent development economists that I've criticized. I really admire them a lot more than I admire Bill Gates. But the good news, there's better news on the horizon. All of these guys were unintentional allies of the status quo of Western-backed oppression in Africa. The better news is that Africans themselves are rebelling against this oppression. There's a new book called Africa Uprising. I want to also give advertisements to other books besides my own book. There's a great book called Africa Uprising, which has documented more than 90 political protests in 40 African countries in the past decade, most in the past 6 years. Their main aim is simply to overthrow their corrupt dictators that are oppressing them. So, for example, in Congo, there was a major demonstration just recently in which people took to the streets of Kinshasa to try to get out of power the ruler that is still in power, that's still the dictator in Congo. In the one country, you may have noticed that during the final stage of the War on Terror, there was one country that was left out, Ghana, that had this unhappy history under the slave trade, had an unhappy history under colonialism, had an unhappy history during the Cold War. But since then, it's had a much happier history. The farmers of Ghana eventually resisted having their cocoa profits taxed away. They were finally won back for themselves the right to be mobile. And political resistors, democracy activists in Ghana, they won the right to have a democracy. Ghana had its first competitive, fair election in the year 2000. Since then, it has had 4 free and fair competitive elections in Ghana. And Ghana, I'm happy to say, is growing very fast out of poverty, partly as a result of the upsurge of economic and political freedom that has come to Ghana. This is a pattern that goes on throughout the continent. If you look at the picture in 1988 and compare it to the picture in 2012, in 1988, there had only been 2 African countries that were classified as politically free by the advocacy organization Freedom House, that I'm calling here the Red Bar Democrats. In 1988, there were 31 African dictators that received the worst possible rating from Freedom House. In 2012, the most recent data I had when I wrote this, the number of dictators have been reduced from 31 to 11, the worst kind of dictators with the worst possible rating. And today, the number of Democrats has increased from 2 to 11. So there is progress throughout Africa, and as I just told you, there's continuing protests seeking for more progress. So the conclusion to this talk is very simple. What can us humanitarian people in the West who care about Africans being denied the right to be mobile, the right to get out of poverty, the right to get out of the bottom of the world income distribution, what can we do? We can protest against our own governments who are supporting local dictators for political reasons, for the political reasons in the US and the UK of the war on terror, for other foreign policy reasons. We can protest our own aid agencies when they themselves directly violate the rights of poor people, as they did in the stories I told you in Uganda and Ethiopia. And we can be on the side of the people of Africa who are campaigning for their own right to be mobile, the right to be free, the right to be free at last, free at last, free at last. Thank you very much.
Professor Easterly, grazie a lei.
Thank you very much, Professor Easterly. Thank you for your great presentation. I think we have some 15-20 minutes for our Q&A session. Now, I think I have a great privilege. I have the mic myself, so I'd like to ask a question myself, if I may. At some point in your book, you say you're against what you refer to as the divorce between development economy and economy full stop. You think that the laws of development economy should be the same laws governing economic growth in any other country, industrialized countries included. Based on that, my question is the following. You've worked at length on the technocratic approach. So I'd like to ask you whether you think that the difficulties of Greece at this present point in time are somehow due to the fact that the approach to the Greek issues have been based on technocracy more than anything, not considering the preferences of Greek citizens. I'm asking you this question because the Greeks just took their vote, and the parliaments of other European countries that provided funding to Greece cast their votes as well to grant Greece some aid on certain conditions. So this is my question. What do you think about that?
So Greece is a good example of technocrats. How do we define technocrats? What would be the difference between an expert who is tyrannical, part of the tyranny of experts, and someone who could be a good expert, who could be useful? I think the difference is that the technocrats, the tyrannical experts, have no accountability to the people whose advice they are giving to effect, the people who they are affecting with their expert advice. That's the example of a tyranny of experts that are not accountable to the people they are affecting. And that has been the historical pattern that I showed you during colonial rule, during the rule of the modern era when the U.S., for political reasons, was backing dictators in Ethiopia and Uganda. So in a more mild form, you could say the same problem exists in Greece, that there are external technocrats who are imposing by coercion on Greece advice whose consequences the technocratic experts don't have to bear. The technocrats they bear no responsibility if they give the wrong advice. That's the problem at the heart of technocracy is the technocrats. They don't suffer any negative consequences if they give bad advice that has disastrous consequences for the people they are affecting. And so that, you could argue, is indeed the situation in Greece, and so we do indeed have a situation of a sort of tyranny of experts.
Grazie. Vedo una domanda qua, ne prenderei tre insieme.
I think we can take a couple of questions altogether.
I have two questions. You said that there are exogenous political reasons which cause underdevelopment and lackness of social mobility. I would like to ask you whether there are also endogenous cultural reasons. Another question. You are speaking about European colonization. I would like to ask you, if Greece is in this situation, is Ottoman imperialism and colonization accountable? Because you are speaking only about European colonizations. Or if Sicily is in this situation, is it because of Arab colonization? Thank you.
Okay, these are two very good.
Vi chiederei per favore di fare domande, non.
I kindly invite you to make questions rather than to make comments. Thank you very much for your question anyway, but please ask questions and do not make comments. Professor Easterly, you quoted 2 episodes of these possessions. Do you think that an important right is that of a private ownership, the ownership of land in the countries you refer to? Do you think that that is an important right? And then do you think that the programs on the way are potentially dangerous?
Un'ultima domanda, dietro vedo una mano alzata.
We've got time for one last question. Can you please stand up? Otherwise we won't see you. Thank you.
I have a question you probably ask quite often, but still. What do you think are the main consequences of rising presence of China in Africa? Whether if you can elaborate on that a little bit. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you for these very interesting questions. So at the beginning, there are 2 very interesting questions first about culture. So I definitely believe culture is a factor in economic development. Part of the culture that recognizes the individual's ability not to conform to the majority, to protest what the majority is doing, to be there, to be a dissident, to be often an innovator, an inventor. That's a very important value for creating innovation and for adapting foreign technology, to have a culture of individualism and dissent that allows for individual creativity. I believe that's a very important root of development. But I believe culture actually interacts very much with a history of autocratic oppression, with a history of oppression. So the way they interact is that, and this actually is another thing that has been a great advance in economics, is the whole advance in the economics of culture. So my colleague at NYU, Alberto Bessin, a great Italian economist, has done some great work on this, and points out that the kind of cultural values that parents teach to their children is affected by the environment in which they find themselves. So if they are in an oppressive environment with a dictator supported by foreign powers, where they know that any dissent will be punished with a jail term, they will not teach their kids the values of individualism, because they don't want their kids to rebel against the local power, the local autocrat, the local dictator, because rebellion, nonconformism, individualism means a life of misery and jail and exile and all those bad things. So the environment, the autocratic environment, is itself one of the causes of culture de-emphasizing, suppressing individualism, and stressing obedience to authority instead of individualism. So in that way, culture and a history of oppression, they interact and feed on each other in a vicious circle of oppression and obedience to authority on one hand, or on the other hand, you can have a virtuous circle of freedom and creativity, the culture of creativity. Then on your second question, so I'm glad you gave me an opportunity to correct the perception that I'm just talking about the Europeans as always being the bad guys. The reality is it's not any one people that is disposed to be the bad guys. Oppression is a crime of opportunity. It was simply because the Europeans had more powerful military technology than did Africans that they had the opportunity to perpetrate the slave trade. They had the opportunity to perpetrate colonialism because they had more powerful military technology. It was that structural opportunity that led to the slave trade and colonialism. But the Europeans were not the only ones that had that structural advantage. I mentioned that there was also an Arab slave trade. The Ottoman Empire was involved in some of the oppression of slaves from Ethiopia. And so, it's not like Europeans are the unique bad guys in the world today. There are many bad guys. But the theory of economists is that oppressors are those who have the opportunity to oppress, in which oppression pays off with very large profits. So what we need to do is change that environment, take away the profit opportunities for oppression, take away the political rewards for oppression. That's why it's so important that all of us who live in Western countries, who see our own government supporting with foreign aid and military aid local oppressors, that we protest against our own governments. And we change the political incentives of our own leaders so that they will lose the next election if they perpetrate oppression of other people. The question about dispossession, private property rights. Yes, I believe that is a very important right, that it's part of the whole structure of rights. I think rights need to be understood as a kind of unified package. I think what happens sometimes is that because of political debates between right and left, the left wants to emphasize some rights more than others, the right wants to emphasize other rights more than others, that there's some selectivity in what are your favorite rights and what are your less favorite rights. I want to kind of do away with any favoritism towards rights and give just as much prominence to political rights, the rights to protest, the rights to demand justice for the poor, as to economic rights like property rights. And property rights should not be seen, I think they are seen incorrectly as something that are wanted for the rich. The rich can usually assure their own property rights because they have bought off the police and the military to protect their own property rights. Like I said, there's this entrenched political and economic elite that protects itself at the top. The people who really need the constitutional legal protection of property rights are the poor, that the government and the elite will not be allowed to take away their land because the land is one of their vehicles of upward mobility, to be able to accumulate your own land, to buy more land, to build a better house, to invest more in the soil fertility of your own agricultural plot. These are vehicles for upward mobility for the poor, and they are denied when the poor are denied their own property rights. And then lastly, China and Africa. I actually play a little game that after every talk I write a little note to myself saying, one of the questions will be about China. And the prediction is always confirmed, so thank you for confirming that. So China, we could talk about it also. Sometimes people raise it as what they think is an example of an authoritarian power that achieved development through very, very dictatorial means. I'm willing to try to debate you on that question if you have that question. That's a separate question. I think what you were asking about is China intervening in Africa, which China is also, again, there's nothing unique about Europeans and being the bad guys. China is also backing local oppressors in Africa for its own selfish reasons, to get awards for Chinese companies and often Chinese state-owned companies to get large awards for construction projects that are sponsored by the local oppressors. And so the Chinese are also complicit in the oppression of Africans. And so we have sort of a worldwide theme that all of us, anywhere in the world, Asia, Europe, Africa, North and South America, the unified theme is if we all care about the majority of Africans, we should all oppose our own rulers from being complicit in the oppression of Africans, from denying them the right to be mobile.
Grazie. Se le domande sono disciplinate, cioè...
Maybe we can take 3 more questions if you raise short question. One in the front, one in the back. Please.
I really liked your call for democracy. As a political scientist, I would like also to say the quality of democracy is very important, and one has to push for more of that, because local elites can also subvert democracy. But also outside forces can subvert democracy, and trade agreements by the European Union with Africa is doing like that. In Ghana, for example, it's very difficult to have tomato processing. They are swarmed by canned tomatoes from Italy, basically. And it is, because of these trade agreements, hardly possible for them now to start their own processing industry.
Okay, prego. Ecco, guardi.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your passionate contribution and your plea for democracy. My question is, what comes first, development or democracy? I mean, there are economists divide into two positions. Some of them think that you need first development to then get to a democratic political situation, and another part of the economists, like Acemoglu, for instance, thinks the contrary. It seems to me that you are standing more with the second group of economists. Second question is, independent of what happens and how much we protest against our governments, there will be a lot of development assistance money given to developing countries. So what do we do with this money? I mean, it seems to me that those young economists that Mr. Fubini was mentioning in the beginning are trying to say, let's use it in an efficient way. So would you be in favor of pulling out all this money from developing countries, or would you be rather part of those that say let's use them efficiently, even though that's a technocratic approach?
Prego. E qui in prima fila, signorina. Qua.
You didn't give a judgment in general on the effectiveness of development official assistance. And I wonder whether you see any reliability in suggestions such as cash on delivery, that is, subjecting official aid to concrete measurement of outcomes, like vaccination, enrollment of people in the graduate grammar school, etc. Because this is, so to speak, the good side of attempts of the Western world to do something against poverty in this world.
Un altro gruppo di domande eccellenti. Prego, professore.
Okay. Thank you for these great questions. So on the first question on the quality of democracy, so one thing I want to make clear at the beginning is I'm not suggesting democracy is some instant utopia that solves all the problems immediately. It's a very long process to get from dictatorship to democracy, and none of us can afford to be self-righteous and say our society is already there. It's obviously none of our societies are already at full democracy, at a full vision of rights for the poor. It's a very long, gradual process. You mentioned one of the problems is with the idea that outside forces back local oppressors is that outside forces could also subvert democracy. That is more likely to happen in a more imperfect democracy in which there is some corruption, in which outside powers like the U.S. could use, U.S. dollars to sort of bribe local officials to support U.S. interests. That's another pattern that sort of goes back to the Cold War, actually. There's one aspect of the CIA interventions that I did not mention. I actually was involved in a paper with with Nathan Nunn as a great empirical development researcher, and Shankar Satyanath at NYU, that found that CIA regime change not only served U.S. foreign policy, it also had a positive effect on the sales of U.S. companies. We found in our paper, this sounds like a conspiracy theory in the U.S. I'm almost embarrassed to be telling you that I have a paper published in the American Economic Review supporting this view that Lenin was right about imperialism, that imperialism does sometimes service the interests of Western capital. In this case, it did, not in a much more modest way than Lenin had in mind, that Western intervention, regime change, has the effect of increasing U.S. exports to the new regime that comes into power afterwards. So that's a pattern that is much more severe under autocracy than it is under democracy. And if it does happen under democracy, it's some problem of local corruption that is going to be cleaned away eventually in the process of transition to being a complete, full democracy. Then the question, what comes first, development or democracy? That's been the big question in development for a long time. And so I'm going to start off saying something kind of insulting and unfair. The inventor of the idea that development comes first before democracy was actually the guy I've already told you about, Lord Haile, under British colonialism. This was an argument that was extremely popular in colonial times, that please let us, the British colonial empire, develop you first, and then later we might think about giving you independence. The British at that time, during Lord Haile's time in office, actually thought their empire was going to go on for centuries. They didn't know that the Africans were going to resist so much and achieve their own independence. So, of course, the reason that's unfair is just because the colonizers embraced that idea does not automatically say that idea is wrong. It could be a good idea that it just happened to be held by the wrong people. So the true state of affairs, I think, on this is that we really don't know what comes first, development or democracy. But let me tell you a couple of things that suggest that we should be more open to democracy. First of all, remember what happened in our own history of those of you in the audience from Italy, those of you from the United States, from the United Kingdom. All of us were roughly to take my country, the U.S., for example, the U.S. in 1776, when Thomas Jefferson was writing, "All men are created equal and have the right to choose life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." At that time, Americans were at the same level or a lower level than Africa today. And yet, democracy did come first in the U.S. So don't forget that example when you're thinking about which comes first. And other similar European examples in which really democracy came first before development. And then the other thing that I would ask you to remember is this is really an argument between two sides in which there is no airtight evidentiary case for either side about which comes first, development or democracy. But which side should bear the burden of proof? We think of freedom, our right not to be jailed, our right not to have our land taken away at gunpoint. We think of those freedoms, those rights, as a good thing in and of themselves. And whereas nobody talks about dictators, about autocracy as a good thing in and of itself, they only justify it as something that is a means to an end, maybe a means to development, a means to poverty alleviation. So what follows from that is the dictator should bear the burden of proof. They should bear the burden of proof of proving that they will be able to deliver material gains that will compensate you for the denial that they are making to you of your political liberties, of your rights. And my reading of the evidence is they do not meet that burden of proof. In fact, there's much more evidence against them than there is for them. I think another symptom of this is that, again, taking my own country, there are lots of American development experts who talk about maybe, dictatorship is better for achieving material gains in other countries, but there are no American experts that I know about that say dictatorship would be better for achieving gains for American citizens at home. Why do we have a double standard that we want dictators for other countries but not for our own country? I think there's some hypocrisy in these arguments that we experts are recommending dictators for other countries but not for ourselves. Then the last question, that's another kind of game that I play with myself on giving talks, is that I know that the discussion at the end will come to the question, what do we do about aid? So I actually did prepare a slide for you, what do we do about aid? Here's my 5-point plan for reforming aid and correcting every single problem in foreign aid. Here's the slide. This is the slide that this is really the slide. This is not a joke. This is my plan. You don't like my plan. It's just white. You don't like it. What's wrong? See, I think I will talk a little bit in a moment about little things we can do about aid that might make things better. But frankly, the reason this question comes up most of the time in development is that people in the aid business are so desperate to change the subject. I want to talk about democracy and rights of the poor, and they don't. And they want to change the subject and ask me instead, or ask any of us who talk about democracy and rights, they want to change the subject to what should we do about aid? How should we redraw the organization chart of the World Bank? Should the World Bank make aid conditional on democracy? I don't think so. I think that would backfire. Should the U.S. invade other countries to impose democracy? No, I don't think so. I think that backfires. I think it's kind of ridiculous to say we're going to coerce other people to have the right to be uncoerced. So we have to keep the subject where it is, that we you have to allow some of us to talk about democracy and not about aid. Aid is a very small player in the big, if we distinguish between aid and development. Development is the transformation of whole societies out of poverty into prosperity. Aid are some of the little good things that you can do for specific groups of poor people, and I'm totally in favor of those. I'm in favor of all the humanitarian relief projects that treat people with malaria, that cure diseases, that give clean water, that make medicines available. Those things are good, but they are not development. Development is not caused by foreign aid. It's caused by the homegrown efforts of poor people themselves asserting their own political and economic rights and responding to their rights to invest in their own futures. We need to have a less condescending, more respectful vision of the dignity of poor people, that they themselves are the agents of change in their own futures, determining their own destiny. Once we recognize and once we insist that our own governments stop backing their own local oppressors, and we all recognize worldwide the right of Africans everywhere to be free, the right to be mobile. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Grazie mille a lei. Grazie.
Thank you very much.
Bene,
il proprio mestiere non diventare semplicemente dei funzionari
in Un'Europa
disuguaglianza. Mafia significa anche impoverimento.
Un treno che parte, una scuola che apre.
Perché dovrei preoccuparmi?
Capiscono che la mafia è tanto più forte quando è una parte.
Come si fa?
La scienza ha senso.
Il contratto